The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Hayes Technologies overlooked Manhattan like a glass fortress, all polished marble and floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the city into a miniature kingdom below. Victoria Hayes stood at the head of the table, her charcoal suit pressed to perfection, her presentation clicker resting in her palm like a weapon she'd never need to draw. The quarterly numbers glowed on the screen behind her. Revenue up 18%, market share expanding into 3 new sectors, stock price climbing steadily toward territory that would make her the youngest self-made female billionaire in tech. The board members sat in leather chairs that cost more than most people earned in a month. Victoria had learned to read those faces years ago, back when being a woman in tech meant proving yourself twice as hard for half the credit. She didn't fight anymore. She won. Thomas Chen, the board chair, leaned forward, his silver reading glasses catching the light. His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone about to ask a question that mattered more than it seemed. Ms. Hayes, before we move to approval, I'd like to clarify something about the AI core system. Protocol 7, the one that runs our entire infrastructure. Victoria's finger hovered over the clicker. She'd presented this system a dozen times, watched it impress investors and intimidate competitors. Protocol 7 was the reason Hayes Technologies had pulled ahead of companies with 10 times their resources. What would you like to know? Who designed it? The question landed softly, but Victoria felt the weight of it. She glanced at the screen, at the elegant architecture of code that had transformed her company from a promising startup into an industry leader. Our team worked on it collaboratively. The primary architect was Marcus Bennett, our former VP of Technology. His name is on all the documentation now. We corrected the oversight last year. Thomas nodded, though something in his expression suggested this wasn't entirely news to him. I ask because Mr. Bennett has submitted a formal request to present at today's meeting. Something about the Bronx Youth Tech Initiative you're partnering with him on. He's waiting outside if you'd like to invite him in. Victoria's throat tightened in a way that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the fact that 12 months ago she'd nearly destroyed the most important relationship in her life. Yes. Please send him in. Victoria's throat tightened in a way that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the fact that 12 months ago she'd nearly destroyed the most important relationship in her life. Yes, please send him in. The door opened and Marcus Bennett walked into the boardroom with the same quiet dignity he'd carried the first night they'd met. He wore a suit that fit better than the one he'd worn to that initial office meeting, carried himself with the confidence of someone who no longer felt like a visitor in spaces designed for wealth. Their eyes met across the polished table, and Victoria felt the weight of everything that had happened between them. The mistakes, the forgiveness, the slow rebuilding of trust that had brought them to this moment. Mr. Bennett, Thomas said, gesturing to an empty chair. Please join us. We're eager to hear about the Bronx Youth Tech Initiative expansion. Marcus nodded his thanks, set his presentation materials on the table, and for just a moment, his gaze found Victoria's again. The slight curve of his lips said what he couldn't in this formal setting. We made it. Against all odds, through all the damage, we found our way back. Victoria returned the smallest of smiles, then straightened in her chair as the board settled in to listen. This wasn't the ending she'd imagined 12 months ago, standing in her hallway after Marcus had told her to stay away. But it was better than any ending she could have planned, because for once in her life, she'd let something unfold without trying to control it. 12 months earlier, her voice remained level, professional, the same tone she used to announce acquisitions or dismiss underperforming executives. But inside, something cold and sharp pressed against her ribs. Protocol 7 was hers. She'd built this company from a studio apartment in Brooklyn, survived on ramen and rejection letters, worked 100 hours a week for years to reach this moment. Someone claiming ownership of her foundation felt like theft, like someone reaching into her chest and trying to extract her heart. Thomas nodded slowly, and Victoria recognized the look in his eyes. Not quite doubt, but something close. The board meeting continued, moving through agenda items with mechanical efficiency, but Victoria barely heard the words. Her mind kept circling back to that name, that claim, the possibility that something fundamental about her empire rested on ground she didn't own. When the meeting adjourned, she returned to her office and pulled up HR records. The name pulled up a file immediately. Marcus Bennett, VP of Technology, March 2016 to September 2017. MIT graduate. Protocol 7 Development Lead. Victoria stared at the professional headshot. Dark skin, serious eyes, slight smile. Nothing triggered recognition. She'd signed his paychecks for 18 months and couldn't remember his face. His resignation email was a single paragraph of professional courtesy. Her response? 2 lines from her automated out-of-office system. She'd never read it, never replied personally, never wondered where he'd gone or why. This man had built the foundation of everything she'd achieved in the past 8 years, and he'd been invisible to her. Her assistant knocked. "Ms. Hayes, your 4 o'clock is here." Victoria smoothed her jacket and turned from the window. She kept moving forward, kept building, kept winning. She'd faced the lawsuit the same way she'd faced every challenge, with resources and determination. The fact that she couldn't remember the man who'd helped her achieve it seemed, in that moment, like a small detail. She didn't know yet that 12 months from now, she'd understand how wrong she'd been about almost everything. 18 months earlier, New Year's Eve arrived in New York City with the kind of cold that turned breath to fog and made the sidewalks glitter with ice. Marcus Bennett stood in his bathroom, adjusting his tie in a mirror that had a crack running through the lower left corner, a souvenir from the day Maya had tried to hang a drawing with tape that wasn't strong enough to hold it. He'd left the crack as a reminder that not everything broken needed replacing, that some damage became part of the story rather than something to erase. The tie was 7 years old, purchased for his wedding, and the fabric had worn thin enough that he could see the pattern of the weave when he held it up to the light. But it was clean, and it was his, and tonight he needed to look like someone who belonged in a restaurant where entrees cost more than his weekly grocery budget. Maya appeared in the doorway, wearing her purple dress with the tiny silver stars, the one she'd picked out at the thrift store because it made her feel like she was carrying the night sky. Her hair was pulled back in braids that Marcus had spent 40 minutes perfecting, watching tutorial videos on his phone while Maya sat patiently and asked questions about whether Mommy had liked this restaurant and whether the stars on her dress were the same stars Mommy could see from heaven. "Daddy, you look handsome." The words came out with that particular earnestness that 7-year-olds possessed, the ability to state facts with complete conviction, as if handsomeness were something measurable and obvious rather than subjective and complicated. Marcus crouched down, meeting her eyes at her level. "You look beautiful, baby girl, like you're made of starlight." Maya grinned, revealing the gap where her front tooth had been before it fell out last month. She'd put it under her pillow with a note for the tooth fairy that said, "Please leave money for Daddy's center," instead of asking for anything for herself. Marcus had cried after she'd fallen asleep, sitting in his kitchen with the tooth in his palm, trying to understand how he'd raised someone so impossibly good in a world that felt increasingly designed to crush that kind of goodness. He'd left $5 under her pillow anyway, with a note from the tooth fairy explaining that the money was specifically for Maya, and that helping people worked best when you took care of yourself first. The note had been written in his worst handwriting, which Maya claimed to believe was authentic tooth fairy script. They took the subway to Manhattan, Maya pressed against the window asking questions about trains and tunnels and whether the drivers got lonely underground. Marcus answered each one the way Julia had taught him. Children's questions were never really about trains. They were about making sense of a world that often refused to make sense. Julia had died 3 years ago, her car crushed by a truck that ran a red light on a Tuesday afternoon while she was driving home from the community center where she worked with homeless teenagers. The police officer who'd come to notify Marcus had used words like instantaneous and didn't suffer, as if those phrases could somehow soften the reality that his wife had left for work that morning and would never come home. That Maya would grow up with only fragments of memory about the woman who'd sung her lullabies and taught her that kindness was a form of courage. The restaurant appeared like something from a different universe, all golden light and elegant architecture. The kind of place where people celebrated anniversaries and closed business deals and pretended that spending $300 on dinner was a reasonable decision. Marcus had been here twice before, both times with Julia, both times saving for months to afford a single evening of pretending they were the kind of people who belonged in spaces designed for wealth and refinement. He'd been here twice before with Julia, their 5th anniversary and after her remission, both times celebrating with champagne and hope. 4 months after that second visit, she was dead, not from cancer but from a truck driver checking his phone at an intersection, erasing the future Marcus had been counting on. He'd avoided this restaurant ever since. Too many ghosts, too much of Julia in every corner. But Maya had found the receipt last week, tucked into a box of Julia's belongings that Marcus had finally worked up the courage to sort through. She'd asked about Mommy's special restaurant, had wanted to know if they could go there so she could feel close to the mother she barely remembered. Marcus couldn't say no. Couldn't explain that walking into that building would hurt in ways he didn't have words for, that some places held memories so sharp they could cut you just by existing. So he'd called and made a reservation, had transferred money from his savings account, the one that was supposed to be for Maya's college, the one that shrank a little more every month as costs rose and nonprofit funding remained stubbornly inadequate, and told himself that this was what fathers did. They showed up. They carried their children through grief even when their own grief threatened to drown them. The maitre d' greeted them at the door, a man in his 60s with silver temples and the kind of practiced courtesy that made everyone feel simultaneously welcomed and evaluated. He checked his tablet, confirmed their reservation, led them through the dining room to a corner table by the window, the same table where Marcus and Julia had always sat. He wondered if the maitre d' remembered them, if the restaurant kept records of that kind of thing, or if it was just coincidence. Either way, Marcus found himself staring at the empty chair across from him, the space where Julia should have been, where she would have been if the universe operated with any kind of fairness or logic. Maya climbed into her seat, arranging her dress carefully so the stars caught the candlelight. She pulled out a drawing she'd made that afternoon, 3 stick figures holding hands. Marcus on the left, Maya in the middle, and Julia floating on a cloud above them. A halo of yellow crayon around her head that Maya had labeled Mommy's Angel Light in careful block letters. "Can we put it on the table so Mommy can see she's still part of dinner?" Marcus's throat tightened, but he managed to nod. Maya propped the drawing against the small vase of flowers, positioning it so Julia's crayon face looked out at the restaurant. A waiter appeared, offered menus, explained the evening's specials in the kind of refined voice that suggested each dish was a work of art, rather than food. Marcus ordered carefully, calculating costs in his head, making sure Maya could have anything she wanted while keeping his own meal to the lower end of the price range. The waiter departed, and Marcus allowed himself to look around the restaurant properly for the first time. The room was full. Couples leaned close over candlelight. Families gathered around tables that could barely contain their laughter. Groups of friends raised glasses in toasts that promised the new year would be better than the old one. Everyone had somewhere to be, someone to celebrate with, a reason to dress up and spend money and believe that midnight mattered. Marcus thought about the empty chair across from him, thought about Maya's drawing with its floating mother figure, about the way his daughter had learned to include death in her artwork because death was simply part of her reality now. He thought about the Bronx Youth Tech Center, about the 15 kids who depended on him to teach them skills that might lift them out of neighborhoods where opportunities came rarely and futures felt predetermined. He thought about his bank account with its dwindling balance, about the grant applications that kept getting rejected, about the weight of trying to be enough for everyone who needed him. He thought about Julia, who had been so much better at this than he was, who'd had some kind of natural gift for seeing people's pain and knowing exactly how to ease it. She used to say her heart had no off switch, that she couldn't walk past suffering without trying to help, that the world was full of people who needed someone to notice them. Maya tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy, look, that lady is sad." Marcus followed his daughter's gaze across the restaurant. Near the entrance, a woman in an expensive coat was speaking with the maitre d', her posture perfect, but something in her shoulders suggesting a tension that went deeper than impatience. Even from a distance, Marcus could read the careful control in her expression, the way she held herself like someone who'd learned that showing vulnerability was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Maybe she's just tired, sweetheart." Maya shook her head, braids swinging with the certainty of her disagreement. "No, she's sad. Like the kind of sad where you smile but your eyes don't. Like you get sometimes when you think I'm not watching." The observation landed with more accuracy than Marcus wanted to acknowledge. He watched the woman turn and walk toward the door, her stride confident but something hollow in the way she moved. Something familiar. He knew that walk, had perfected it himself in the months after Julia died, the appearance of composure when everything inside was crumbling. "She doesn't have anyone." Maya's voice was quiet, matter-of-fact, the way she stated truths that adults preferred to ignore. "Nobody's waiting for her." The words hit Marcus harder than they should have. He looked at the empty chair beside him, at Julia's crayon portrait propped against the flowers, at the restaurant full of people celebrating connections while this woman walked toward the cold night alone. He thought about what Julia would have done. She'd never been able to walk past someone in need without stopping, had possessed some kind of radar for human loneliness that Marcus had always admired but never quite understood. Now, sitting in the restaurant where he'd celebrated his life with her, staring at the space she should have occupied, he understood something he hadn't fully grasped before. He'd been eating dinner with a ghost for 3 years, carrying Julia's memory like a shield that protected him from having to risk connection with anyone new, using his grief as an excuse to stay closed off, to keep everyone at arm's length, to pretend that being a good father to Maya was enough. But Maya was 7 years old, and she'd just identified another person's loneliness with the kind of clarity that suggested she knew exactly what it looked like, which meant she'd been watching him, studying his isolation, learning that losing someone meant building walls rather than bridges. That realization felt like ice water down his spine. Marcus stood up. The movement was instinctive, the decision made before he'd fully processed the implications. Maya looked up at him, her face brightening with something that looked like relief, as if she'd been hoping he'd do exactly this. "We're inviting her?" "Yeah, baby, I think we are." He walked across the restaurant, weaving between tables, aware of the woman's hand on the door handle, aware that he had maybe 10 seconds before she disappeared into the Manhattan night, and this moment passed into the category of chances not taken. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear of rejection, but from the sudden weight of what he was about to do. Invite a stranger into the space where Julia's memory lived. Acknowledge that the empty chair existed and could be filled. "Excuse me." The woman turned, and Marcus saw her face properly for the first time. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe mid-40s, with features that suggested she'd been beautiful once, and still would be if the hardness in her expression ever softened. Her eyes carried the particular wariness of someone who'd learned to anticipate trouble, to calculate the angle before anyone revealed what they wanted. "We have an extra chair at our table. You're welcome to join us, if you want." The offer came out simpler than he'd planned, stripped of explanation or justification. The woman's eyes flicked past him to where Maya sat, then back to his face, searching for whatever angle this represented. "I'm fine, but thank you." Her voice matched her appearance, controlled, polished, designed to end conversations rather than encourage them. Marcus recognized the tone because he'd used it himself, the verbal equivalent of a closed door. But he also heard something underneath it, a slight crack in the perfect surface that suggested the door wasn't locked quite as firmly as it appeared. Maya appeared beside him, having abandoned her seat to join the mission. She looked up at the woman with the kind of unfiltered directness that children possessed before the world taught them to look away from discomfort. "Please. It's sad to eat alone on New Year's, and we have space. Daddy says everyone should have somewhere to be when the year changes." The woman's expression flickered, some emotion moving beneath the controlled surface too quickly for Marcus to identify. She looked down at Maya, then back at Marcus, and something in her posture shifted fractionally. "Okay. Thank you." She followed them back to the table, and Marcus pulled out the chair that had been empty all evening, the space where Julia should have been. The woman sat down carefully, as if the furniture might be a trap, her expensive coat draped over her shoulders in a way that suggested she wasn't fully committing to staying. "I'm Marcus. This is my daughter, Maya." Victoria. No last name offered, no explanation of why she'd been alone or where she'd come from. Just a single word that felt like a test, as if she were waiting to see whether Marcus would push for more information or accept what she chose to give. Maya picked up her menu, studying it with the serious concentration she brought to everything that mattered. "What do you do, Miss Victoria?" The question was innocent, the kind of thing children asked because they genuinely wanted to know, not because they were gathering intelligence or making judgments. Victoria's pause suggested she was calibrating her response, deciding how much truth to share. "I work with technology. Computers. Daddy works with computers too. He teaches kids how to code. He's really good at fixing things that are broken." Marcus felt heat rise to his face, the particular embarrassment of having a 7-year-old serve as your hype man. "Maya thinks everyone's a genius. Don't let her inflate your expectations." Victoria's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but something approaching it. "What kind of work do you do?" The question was directed at him, genuine curiosity underneath the careful politeness. Marcus wondered what she saw when she looked at him. A man in a 7-year-old tie eating at a restaurant he could barely afford. A single father with a daughter who carried pictures of her dead mother. Someone whose life had taken him so far from his MIT education that the distance felt like a different universe. "I run a youth center in the Bronx. We teach coding and computer science to kids who don't usually get access to that kind of education. Try to give them skills that might open doors." "That's good work." The words were polite but felt genuine, absent the performative enthusiasm that wealthy people sometimes deployed when discussing charitable endeavors. Victoria picked up her menu, studied it with the same careful attention Maya had shown, and Marcus realized she was buying time, processing this situation she'd stumbled into. The waiter returned, took Victoria's order, disappeared with the efficient discretion of someone trained to be present but invisible. Maya launched into an explanation of her drawing, pointing out the details of her mother's angel light and the way she'd drawn the three of them holding hands because that's what families did, even when someone was in heaven. Victoria listened without interrupting, without the glazed expression adults sometimes adopted when children talked about things that made them uncomfortable. She asked questions, not the condescending kind designed to humor a child, but real questions that suggested she was actually listening. "Your mother sounds like she was special." Maya nodded with absolute certainty. "She was the best. Daddy says she could see people's hearts, that she always knew when someone needed help." "Do you have kids?" Victoria's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "No, I work a lot." "Don't you get lonely?" The question landed in the sudden silence like a stone dropped into still water. Marcus touched Maya's hand gently, a silent signal that she was venturing into territory that might be too personal. But Victoria's eyes had gone distant, focused on something far beyond the restaurant's elegant walls. Yes, sometimes I do. The admission seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised Marcus. Victoria blinked as if waking from a momentary trance and reached for her water glass with a hand that trembled slightly before she caught herself and steadied it. Marcus recognized the gesture. The small betrayal of control quickly suppressed, the way people caught themselves revealing more than they'd intended and tried to walk it back. Their food arrived, presented with the kind of artistic arrangement that made it seem almost wrong to disturb. Maya dug into her pasta with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of someone who hadn't yet learned to be concerned about appearances. Marcus cut his chicken carefully, aware of Victoria across from him, aware of how strange this situation must be for her, sitting with two strangers who'd pulled her back from the edge of leaving. The conversation flowed in unexpected directions. Maya asked about Victoria's favorite color, her favorite animal, whether she'd ever seen the ocean at night when it looked like liquid stars. Victoria answered each question with increasing ease, the careful control in her voice gradually loosening until she almost sounded like someone having dinner with friends rather than strangers she'd met 20 minutes ago. Marcus watched her interact with Maya and saw something underneath the polished surface, a loneliness that had calcified into routine, a isolation so complete that being invited to a stranger's table felt like being handed a life preserver she hadn't realized she'd been drowning without. He recognized it because he'd been there himself, had spent 3 years building walls around his grief and calling it strength. Victoria asked him about the youth center, and Marcus found himself talking about the kids he worked with. Teenagers from neighborhoods where college felt like a fantasy, where the systems designed to help them often ended up trapping them instead. He talked about teaching coding to students who'd never touched a computer that wasn't cracked or outdated, about watching them discover they were good at something that could translate into careers and futures and ways out. It sounds like you're making a real difference. Victoria's voice carried something that might have been envy, though it disappeared too quickly for Marcus to be certain. I'm trying. Funding is always tight, equipment is always outdated, and sometimes I wonder if I'm actually helping or just putting a Band-Aid on problems that need surgery. But the kids keep showing up, so I keep showing up too. That's more than most people do. The words were quiet, almost lost in the ambient noise of the restaurant, but Marcus heard the weight behind them. He wanted to ask what she meant, wanted to understand what kind of life produced that particular tone of self-judgment. But Maya chose that moment to knock over her water glass. The liquid spread across the white tablecloth in a dark stain, reaching toward Victoria's side of the table with the inevitability of spilled things seeking lowest ground. Maya's face crumpled, her eyes going wide with the kind of panic that suggested she thought she'd ruined everything. I'm sorry. Victoria reached out before Marcus could move, catching the glass before it rolled off the table, grabbing a napkin to dam the worst of the spread. Her expensive coat had caught some of the water, a dark patch spreading across the fabric that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly rent. Hey, it's okay, it's just water. Maya looked up at her, tears threatening to spill over. But I got your pretty coat all wet. Coat's dry. And honestly, Victoria looked down at the garment with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read, something that might have been revelation or resignation. I never really liked this one anyway. Too expensive for what it is. Just something I bought because someone told me it was what successful people wore. The confession seemed to surprise her even more than her earlier admission about loneliness. She met Marcus's eyes over Maya's head, and something passed between them that felt like recognition. Two people who'd been performing their lives for so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to just exist. The waiter appeared with fresh napkins and a new tablecloth, managing the crisis with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd seen worse. Maya's tears dried as quickly as they'd threatened, her resilience bouncing back with the elasticity of childhood. Victoria ordered dessert for the table without asking permission, and Marcus didn't have the heart to tell her he'd been calculating whether he could afford it. They ate chocolate cake that tasted like it cost more than it should, and Maya told stories about her second-grade class and the boy who ate paste and the girl who could do a handstand for a full minute. Victoria listened with the kind of attention that suggested she was cataloging these details, storing them away as if they mattered, as if the mundane details of a 7-year-old's life were worth remembering. The restaurant began counting down to midnight around them, the energy in the room building like an approaching wave. Champagne appeared on tables, people stood and gathered in clusters, the air filled with anticipation for the moment when the calendar would turn and everyone could pretend the future might be different from the past. Marcus pulled Maya close, feeling her small body fit against his side the way it had since she was an infant. He thought about Julia, about how she should have been here for this, about how Maya was growing up without the person who'd loved her most fiercely. He thought about the empty chair that had been filled for one evening by a stranger who felt less strange with every passing minute. 10, 9, 8. Maya turned to Victoria, her face bright with excitement, uncomplicated by the adult awareness of how arbitrary midnight really was. "Happy New Year, Miss Victoria." She threw her arms around Victoria's shoulders in a hug that was brief but fierce, the way only children hugged, without reservation, without calculation, without the 1,000 small hesitations that adults carried. Victoria's arms came up slowly, as if she'd forgotten how to receive affection, her hand settling carefully on Maya's back before the girl pulled away. Victoria's eyes were wet when Maya released her, though she blinked rapidly and turned toward the window, pretending sudden interest in the view of the city. Marcus recognized the gesture, the quick recovery, the refusal to let emotions spill over into something visible, and therefore vulnerable. "Happy New Year." Victoria's voice was quieter than it had been all evening, scraped raw by something she probably hadn't expected to feel. Marcus extended his hand across the table, and she took it after a moment's hesitation. Her grip was firm but not crushing, the handshake of someone who'd learned to match force with force but didn't quite remember how to let it soften into something gentler. "Happy New Year, Victoria. Thank you for staying. Thank you for inviting me." The words were simple, but Marcus heard layers underneath them. Gratitude that went deeper than a shared meal, acknowledgement of something neither of them had quite named, but both recognized. They'd saved each other tonight, in small ways that might not seem like salvation, but were. Pulled each other back from different kinds of cold that had nothing to do with the winter waiting outside. The restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm as midnight receded into the past. People settled back into their seats, ordered more wine, resumed conversations that would carry them toward closing time. Marcus signaled for the check, his stomach tightening slightly at what the number would be, reminding himself it was worth it for Maya, for the memory of Julia, for whatever this strange evening had become. Victoria reached for her purse. "Let me—" "No." The word came out sharper than Marcus intended, and he softened his tone immediately. "Thank you, but this is my table. You were our guest." He could see her wanting to argue, could see the instinct in her to solve this problem with money the way she probably solved most problems. But something in his expression must have communicated that this mattered, that accepting her generosity would shift the evening from an act of kindness into a transaction he couldn't afford in more ways than one. Victoria's hand retreated from her purse. "All right." They gathered their belongings, Maya clutching her drawing carefully to keep Julia's crayon face from smudging. Victoria stood, smoothing her coat with its water stain, and Marcus saw her hesitate before pulling a business card from her purse. She held it out, her expression carefully neutral. "If you're ever looking for corporate partners for your center, or if you just want to talk about education programs, my email is there." Marcus took the card, studying the embossed letters. Victoria Hayes, Chief Executive Officer, Hayes Technologies. He'd heard of the company. Everyone in tech had heard of it. A rising star in AI development that was eating market share from competitors who'd been in business for decades. He looked from the card to the woman in front of him, trying to reconcile the polished CEO with the person who'd admitted to loneliness over pasta and chocolate cake. He didn't give her his card because he didn't have one. The youth center ran on a shoestring budget that didn't extend to business cards for the director. Instead, he pulled out his phone and showed her the center's website, the simple design that Rosa had built for free during her lunch breaks. Bronx Youth Tech Center, if you're ever in the neighborhood. Victoria took her own phone out, took a picture of his screen rather than asking him to text her the link. The gesture felt deliberate, a way of keeping control over when and how she might reach out, maintaining the careful distance even as something between them suggested distance was the last thing either of them wanted. Maya tugged on Victoria's coat, looking up with her gap-toothed grin. "Will we see you again?" The question was simple, but the silence that followed it felt heavy with implications. Victoria crouched down, bringing herself to Maya's eye level in a gesture that seemed to cost her something. "I don't know, Maya. I hope so." "Me too. You're nice, and you didn't get mad when I spilled water on you." Victoria's laugh was quiet, almost surprised, as if she hadn't expected to find anything funny about this evening. "It was just water, and you're pretty great yourself." They left the restaurant together, stepping out into the cold that felt sharper after the warmth inside. People streamed past them on the sidewalk, couples holding hands, groups singing fragments of songs, the city alive with the energy of a night that promised new beginnings whether or not anyone believed in them. Marcus flagged a taxi for Victoria because letting her walk to the subway felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. She climbed in with a final wave to Maya, who waved back with her whole arm, the drawing still clutched in her other hand. The taxi pulled away, and Marcus watched it disappear into the river of red taillights flowing down the avenue. Maya leaned against his side, her head barely reaching his hip. "I like her, Daddy." "Me too, baby girl." "Do you think Mommy would have liked her?" The question lodged in Marcus's chest like something sharp and tender at once. He thought about Julia, about her ability to see straight through people's defenses to the vulnerable humanity underneath. He thought about Victoria's careful control slowly cracking over the course of an evening, about the loneliness she'd admitted to, about the way she'd hugged Maya back like someone remembering how. "Yeah, I think Mommy would have liked her a lot." They took the subway home, Maya falling asleep against his shoulder while the train rattled through tunnels. Marcus stared at his reflection in the dark window, seeing himself and not himself. The man he'd become overlaid with the ghost of who he'd been. He thought about the empty chair at dinner, about how easily Victoria had filled it, about whether that meant something or nothing. He thought about the business card in his pocket, about whether he'd ever use it or if this would remain what it had been, a single evening of connection in a city of 8 million people, who mostly never connected at all. When they got home, Marcus tucked Maya into bed and sat in his kitchen with a cup of tea he didn't drink. He pulled out his laptop, typed Hayes Technologies into the search bar, watched the results populate. Articles about Victoria's rise in the industry, profiles that praised her business acumen and questioned her work-life balance, photographs of her at conferences and product launches, always alone, always perfectly composed. He clicked through to the company's leadership page, found her official biography. Listed among her accomplishments was a section on technology development, including something called Protocol 7 that had revolutionized their AI capabilities. Marcus read the description, recognized the architecture immediately because he'd seen it before, had built something similar back when he was VP at a different tech company, back when he'd worked at Hayes Technologies. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He enlarged her photo, studied her face with new attention, searching for recognition underneath the years and the context. The woman he'd worked for had been younger, harder, so focused on building her empire that she barely looked at the people helping her build it. She'd been on her phone during his final presentation, had sent him an automated response to his resignation, had never once asked why he was leaving. She didn't remember him. He'd known that the moment she'd sat down at dinner, had known it from the complete absence of recognition in her eyes. 8 years and grief had changed him enough that he'd become invisible even to someone who'd once signed his paychecks. Marcus closed the laptop and sat in the dark of his kitchen, listening to Maya's quiet breathing from the other room. He thought about telling Victoria who he was, about whether it would change anything or just make everything more complicated. He thought about the way she'd admitted to loneliness, about whether someone who'd fired him by automated message deserved his honesty or his silence. He thought about Julia, about what she would have said if she were here. She'd probably tell him that everyone deserved second chances, that people changed, that holding on to past hurts only poisoned the person doing the holding. She'd probably tell him to see Victoria as she was now, rather than who she'd been, to judge her by tonight, rather than years ago. But Julia wasn't here, and Marcus was tired of making decisions based on what a ghost would have wanted, rather than what he actually felt. He pulled Victoria's business card from his pocket, studied the embossed letters in the dim light from the street. Her email address stared back at him, a door that could open or stay closed depending on what he chose to do. Marcus set the card on the counter and went to bed without deciding anything. Tomorrow would come whether he was ready for it or not, and he'd figure out what to do with tonight when tomorrow forced him to. He didn't know yet that Victoria was sitting in her penthouse with the same business card in her hand, the one she'd photographed rather than asking for, trying to understand why a stranger's kindness had cracked something inside her that she'd thought was sealed shut. He didn't know that in 18 months they'd both understand that some encounters weren't accidents at all, but rather the universe's way of giving people exactly what they needed, even when they were too lost to ask for it. He didn't know that the empty chair at dinner had been filled by the one person who could teach him that letting someone new in didn't erase the person who'd left, that love wasn't a finite resource that ran out when you gave it to someone else. He only knew that tonight had felt like something important, even if he couldn't yet name what that something was. And sometimes, that was enough. 4 days passed before Marcus opened his laptop and typed Victoria's name into the search bar again. He told himself he was just curious, that looking up someone you'd shared dinner with didn't mean anything more than basic due diligence in an age where strangers could be anyone. But his hands knew better than his rationalizations, and they typed her company name with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this before. Hayes Technologies. The logo appeared instantly, that clean geometric design that tech companies favored when they wanted to look innovative without being threatening. Marcus clicked through to the About page, past the mission statement about transforming industries through artificial intelligence, past the diversity statement that probably looked good on paper but meant nothing in practice, until he found the leadership section. Victoria's photo occupied the top position, larger than the other executives, her expression serious but approachable in that calculated way of professional headshots. Below her face, the biography detailed her rise from a studio apartment startup to a billion-dollar valuation, the kind of story that business magazines loved because it suggested anyone could make it if they just worked hard enough and wanted it badly enough. Marcus scrolled down to the technology section, found the paragraph about Protocol 7. The description made it sound revolutionary, groundbreaking, a leap forward in machine learning architecture that had positioned Hayes Technologies ahead of competitors who'd been developing AI for decades. No mention of who'd actually built it. No names attached to the innovation that had transformed the company from promising to dominant. He clicked back to the leadership page, studied the faces of the other executives. None of them looked familiar, but that meant nothing. 8 years was long enough for an entire organization to turn over, for the people who'd built the foundation to be replaced by those who'd arrived after the foundation was already solid. His phone buzzed. Rosa's name appeared on the screen, a text asking if he was coming to the center today or if she should start the afternoon coding session without him. Marcus glanced at the clock, realized he'd been staring at his laptop for 40 minutes, lost in the strange territory between past and present where Victoria existed as both the CEO who'd barely noticed him and the woman who'd admitted to loneliness over chocolate cake. He closed the laptop without answering the question of what he planned to do with the information he'd found. The center needed him, and 15 teenagers didn't care about his complicated history with a billionaire who didn't remember his name. They cared about whether the computers would work today, whether the donated equipment would last another semester, whether learning to code would actually translate into the opportunities Marcus kept promising them it would. The Bronx Youth Tech Center occupied the second floor of a building that had been a garment factory in the 1950s, a community center in the 1980s, and a series of failed businesses in between. The space was large and drafty, with industrial windows that rattled in winter and inadequate air conditioning that barely functioned in summer. The computers lined up on folding tables were a mixed collection of donations from companies upgrading their equipment, none of them less than 5 years old, several of them held together with electrical tape and optimism. Rosa looked up when Marcus entered, her expression shifting from concentration to relief. She was 10 years older than him, a former software engineer who'd left corporate work after her son was born and never quite found her way back. She volunteered 3 afternoons a week, teaching with the kind of patience that suggested she genuinely enjoyed explaining the same concept 17 different ways until someone finally understood. "Thought you might have forgotten us." "Just running late, sorry." Rosa studied him with the particular attention of someone who'd known him long enough to read the spaces between his words. "You okay? You seem distracted." Marcus hung his coat on the rack by the door, bought time by checking which students had already arrived. 7 of them scattered around the room, some working independently on projects, others clustered around a single screen arguing about the best way to debug a function that kept returning errors. "I'm fine, just thinking about funding. The grant application for the city program is due next week." It wasn't exactly a lie. The grant application was due, and he had been thinking about it, even if that wasn't what had kept him staring at his laptop for 40 minutes that morning. Rosa accepted the explanation with a small nod, though her eyes suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. The afternoon unfolded in the familiar rhythm of teaching, helping a student understand why their loop wasn't terminating, explaining recursion for the 3rd time to someone who kept insisting it made no sense, celebrating when a 15-year-old successfully built her first functioning calculator program. Marcus lost himself in the work the way he always did, letting the immediate needs of the students push everything else into background noise. At 5 o'clock, Rosa started shutting down computers while Marcus gathered abandoned notebooks and pencils. The students filtered out in clusters, their voices echoing in the stairwell as they argued about homework and weekend plans and whether the subway or the bus would get them home faster. Rosa waited until the last student left before speaking. "You going to tell me what's really bothering you?" Marcus looked up from the notebook he was organizing, met her eyes, and found himself suddenly tired of carrying information alone. "I had dinner on New Year's Eve, at that restaurant Julia and I used to go to." Rosa's expression softened immediately. "How was that?" "Hard. Good. Complicated." He paused, weighing how much to share, then decided that keeping secrets took more energy than speaking truth. "We invited someone to sit with us, a woman who was there alone." Maya noticed she looked sad. And we had dinner together. She was nice. Good with Maya. Seemed like she needed the company as much as we needed to not be eating with a ghost. Rosa leaned against one of the tables, crossing her arms in the universal posture of someone settling in for a longer conversation. This is the part where you tell me what's making you look like someone just told you the sun isn't actually a star. Marcus pulled out his phone, navigated to Victoria's company page, handed the device to Rosa. She studied the screen, her expression shifting from neutral to confused to something that might have been disbelief. Wait, this is the woman from dinner? Victoria Hayes? Yeah. The CEO of Hayes Technologies? Yeah. Rosa scrolled through the page, reading quickly. Marcus, this company is worth billions. She's one of the most successful women in tech. What was she doing eating alone on New Year's Eve? Being lonely. Same as me. Rosa looked up from the phone, her eyes sharp with understanding. You didn't tell her who you are. It wasn't a question. Marcus took the phone back, pocketed it without looking at the screen again. She didn't recognize me. 8 years and grief change a face enough that I was invisible to someone who used to sign my paychecks. Are you going to tell her? The question hung in the dusty air between them. Marcus thought about Victoria's admission over dinner, about the crack in her carefully controlled surface when she'd said yes to loneliness. He thought about the way she'd looked at Maya's drawing of Julia's angel light, about how she'd ordered dessert without asking and hugged his daughter back like someone remembering how. I don't know. Part of me wants to see if she's changed. If she can actually see people now instead of just using them. Rosa pushed away from the table, gathered her coat and bag with the efficient movements of someone who'd said what she needed to say and was ready to leave the decision with its owner. Just remember that testing people usually tells you more about yourself than about them. She left before Marcus could respond, her footsteps fading down the stairwell until the building settled into its evening quiet. Marcus sat in the empty classroom, surrounded by old computers and half-finished projects, and the accumulated hope of teenagers who believed him when he said their futures could be different. His phone buzzed. An email notification appeared on the screen, the sender's name making his breath catch slightly. Victoria Hayes. Subject line: Partnership Opportunity. Marcus opened the message, his heart beating harder than the situation warranted. Mr. Bennett, I wanted to follow up on our conversation at dinner regarding your youth center. Hayes Technologies is exploring corporate partnership opportunities with educational nonprofits, particularly those focused on underserved communities. I'd be interested in learning more about your program and discussing potential collaboration. Would you be available for a meeting at my office? Best regards, Victoria Hayes. The email was professional, carefully worded, the kind of corporate outreach that probably went out to dozens of organizations every month. But Marcus recognized the subtext underneath the formal language. This was Victoria reaching out, choosing to maintain the connection they'd started over dinner instead of letting it dissolve into the category of pleasant but meaningless encounters. He read the message 3 times, analyzing each word for hidden meanings, searching for clues about what she wanted beyond the stated purpose. Partnership opportunities could mean money, equipment, mentorship, or nothing at all. Corporate interest in nonprofits often translated into photo opportunities and press releases that generated goodwill without requiring substantial commitment. But there was another possibility. Maybe Victoria actually cared. Maybe something about that dinner had affected her the same way it had affected him, opened a door that had been closed for so long she'd forgotten it existed. Maybe she was reaching out not because her company needed another tax deduction, but because she'd seen something in his work, or in him, that mattered. Marcus started typing a response 4 different times, deleting each attempt before it progressed past the first sentence. Too eager, too casual, too formal, too presumptuous. He finally settled on something that struck a balance between professional interest and personal acknowledgement. Ms. Hayes, thank you for reaching out. I'd be happy to discuss potential partnership between Hayes Technologies and Bronx Youth Tech Center. I'm available Thursday afternoon if that works with your schedule. The work we do here matters deeply to the students we serve, and I'm always interested in conversations with people who understand that technology can be a tool for expanding opportunity rather than just maximizing profit. Marcus Bennett. He hit send before he could second-guess the slight edge in his final sentence, the implication that most tech companies cared more about their bottom line than about actual impact. If Victoria was the same person she'd been 8 years ago, the comment would either bounce off her completely or make her defensive. If she'd changed, she'd recognize it as a challenge worth meeting. Her response came back in less than an hour. Thursday at 2 p.m. works. My office is at 440 Fifth Avenue, 32nd floor. And for what it's worth, I agree with you. Technology should expand opportunity. That's harder than it sounds, but it's worth trying to get right. See you Thursday. Victoria. Marcus stared at the screen, at the subtle shift from formal Ms. Hayes to just Victoria, at the acknowledgement that getting it right was hard. The response felt genuine rather than performative, personal rather than corporate. He wanted to believe it meant something. He wanted to believe a lot of things that experience had taught him were usually disappointments dressed up as possibilities. Thursday arrived with the kind of gray January cold that made the city feel smaller. Everyone hunched inside their coats, hurrying between buildings to minimize time exposed to wind that cut through layers. Marcus dressed carefully, choosing his interview suit, the one he'd bought for the VP position 8 years ago and barely worn since, and the tie that Maya said made him look like someone important. The subway ride to Midtown Manhattan felt longer than usual, each stop extending as if the train knew he was heading toward something that might change everything or nothing at all. He emerged at the Fifth Avenue station, joined the river of people flowing through streets lined with buildings that touched the sky and reflected wealth in their glass facades. Marcus arrived at Hayes Technologies 15 minutes early, passing through security with a visitor badge that felt like a temporary visa. The 32nd floor reception was all minimalist design and young employees moving with purposeful efficiency. No one looked at him twice, just another visitor temporarily granted access to a world he didn't belong to. Victoria appeared after exactly 7 minutes, walking toward him with the same careful control he'd noticed at dinner. But something was different now. The expensive coat was gone, replaced by a charcoal blazer over dark pants, and her hair was pulled back in a way that made her face sharper, more severe. This was CEO Victoria, the woman whose photo appeared on magazine covers and conference stages, the one who commanded rooms full of people who controlled billions of dollars. She extended her hand, and Marcus stood to shake it, noting the firmness of her grip and the way her eyes scanned his face as if searching for something specific. Mr. Bennett, thank you for coming. Ms. Hayes, I appreciate you making time. The formality felt strange after the intimacy of their dinner conversation, but Marcus understood the necessity. This was her territory, her professional space, and he was here as a potential partner rather than a stranger she'd shared a meal with. He followed her through a maze of open-plan workspace where employees sat at standing desks with multiple monitors, past conference rooms with glass walls that made privacy visual even when conversations remained confidential, until they reached a corner office that commanded views of the city in 2 directions. The space was exactly what Marcus would have predicted: minimalist, organized, devoid of personal touches, except for a small shelf holding 3 books about business strategy and a glass sculpture that might have been art, or might have been another tech company award. Victoria gestured toward a chair facing her desk, then seemed to reconsider and moved toward a small seating area by the windows instead. This is more comfortable and less intimidating. They sat in chairs that were indeed more comfortable than the reception furniture, angled toward each other but with enough distance to maintain professional boundaries. Victoria pulled out a tablet, opened a document, and Marcus recognized the shift into business mode. The meeting had officially begun. I've reviewed your center's website and your mission statement. You serve approximately how many students? 150, ranging from 6th grade through high school. Most of them qualify for free lunch programs, most come from families where nobody's gone to college, and almost all of them have never had access to quality technology education before they find us. Victoria took notes on her tablet, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. What's your retention rate? 85%. Students who start with us in 6th grade usually stay through graduation. And college acceptance? 62% of our graduates go on to higher education, most of them with some kind of scholarship support. For context, the neighborhood average is about 20%. Victoria looked up from her tablet, and Marcus saw genuine interest in her expression rather than the performative engagement that wealthy people sometimes displayed when discussing charitable work. That's impressive. What do you attribute the success to? Marcus leaned back, considering how honest to be, then decided that anything less than complete honesty would be a waste of both their time. We treat them like they matter. We show up consistently. We don't make promises we can't keep, but we keep every promise we make. And we teach them skills that are actually valuable rather than just checking boxes on someone's diversity initiative. The last part came out sharper than he'd intended, but Victoria didn't flinch. Instead, something that might have been respect flickered across her face. You think most corporate education programs are just checking boxes? I think most corporate education programs are designed to make companies feel good about themselves, while changing as little as possible about the actual systems that keep kids in my neighborhood from accessing opportunity. Victoria set down her tablet, giving him her full attention in a way that reminded Marcus of dinner, of the moment she'd admitted to loneliness and something in her carefully maintained surface had cracked. You're probably right. And for what it's worth, I don't want this to be another photo opportunity for our corporate social responsibility page. If Hayes Technologies partners with your center, I want it to actually help your students. Then what are you offering? The question was direct, possibly too direct for a first meeting, but Marcus was tired of dancing around substance. Victoria didn't seem offended by the bluntness. She stood, walked to her desk, retrieved a folder, brought it back to the seating area. Equipment upgrade, 30 new computers, proper networking infrastructure, software licenses for professional development tools, plus mentorship. I'd commit several of our senior engineers to spending time at your center, working directly with students who show aptitude for advanced programming. Marcus took the folder, opened it, found detailed specifications for equipment that would transform his center from barely functional to actually competitive with what students in wealthy neighborhoods had access to. The total value listed at the bottom made his breath catch. This is $65,000 worth of equipment. Is that a problem? Marcus looked up from the folder, met Victoria's eyes, and saw genuine confusion there. She actually didn't understand why receiving this much help might be complicated for him. He thought about Rosa's warning, about how testing people said more about yourself than about them. He thought about the distance between the world Victoria inhabited and the world his students lived in. The gap so wide that generosity from one side could feel like condescension to the other. Ms. Hayes, Victoria, this is incredibly generous. But I need you to understand something. These kids, they're proud. They don't want charity. They want to earn what they get, to prove they're good enough to deserve the same opportunities that other kids take for granted. This isn't charity, it's investment. I'm not giving your center equipment out of pity. I'm doing it because developing talent in underserved communities is good business strategy, and because your retention and college acceptance numbers suggest you're doing something worth supporting. The answer was smooth, probably rehearsed, the kind of corporate language that made exploitation sound like empowerment. But underneath it, Marcus heard something that might have been sincerity, or might have been Victoria's talent for making people believe what she wanted them to believe. And what do you get out of it? Tax deduction. Positive press if we want it, though we don't have to publicize the partnership if you prefer. access to potential future employees who've been trained in our preferred methodologies, and she paused, and Marcus saw the careful control slip slightly, revealing something more personal underneath. And the knowledge that I'm actually helping instead of just writing checks and pretending that solves anything. The admission surprised him, its honesty cutting through the corporate language like light through fog. Marcus closed the folder, set it on the table between them, and made a decision that felt both necessary and potentially catastrophic. "Can I ask you something personal?" Victoria's posture shifted, her shoulders straightening slightly as if preparing for impact. "You can ask? Why were you alone on New Year's Eve? Someone with your resources, your success. Why were you standing in a restaurant with no place to sit?" The silence stretched long enough that Marcus thought she might not answer, might retreat behind professional boundaries and end the meeting before it progressed further. But Victoria surprised him by leaning forward, her elbows on her knees, her hands clasped together in a gesture that looked like prayer or plea. "Because I've spent the last 20 years building something that took all my time and attention, and somewhere along the way, I forgot to build a life that included people. I have employees and investors and competitors and journalists who write about me, but I don't have friends. I don't have family I speak to regularly. I don't have anyone who would notice if I disappeared for a week except to wonder why emails weren't getting answered." The words came out flat, stated as facts rather than confessions, but Marcus heard the pain underneath them. He recognized it because he'd felt it himself. That particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who needed you for what you could do, rather than who you were. "That sounds hard." "It is. And I didn't realize how hard until your daughter invited me to sit at your table. And for 3 hours, I got to be just Victoria instead of the CEO or the billionaire or the woman on magazine covers. I got to be someone having dinner with people who didn't want anything from me except company." Victoria looked up, met his eyes directly. "So yes, I'm offering your center $65,000 worth of equipment. And yes, it's partially because it makes good business sense. But it's also because you showed me kindness when you had no reason to. And I want to return that in the only way I know how. By being useful. By solving problems. By giving you resources you need." Ooh. Marcus absorbed this, turning it over in his mind, searching for the trap or the angle or the hidden cost. But all he found was what he'd seen at dinner. A woman who'd achieved everything she'd aimed for and discovered that achievement without connection was just expensive loneliness. "All right, let's talk about partnership. But I need you to understand something. If we do this, it's not because I'm grateful for your charity. It's because you're right. This equipment would help our students, and helping them matters more than my pride." Victoria's smile was small but genuine. "Fair enough. And I need you to understand something too. I'm not good at this. At relationships, at reading social cues, at understanding when I'm overstepping. If I do something that makes you uncomfortable, I need you to tell me directly instead of expecting me to figure it out on my own." Deal. They spent the next hour discussing logistics, delivery schedules, installation requirements, which engineers might be available for mentorship, how to structure the partnership to benefit both the center and Hayes Technologies without creating dependency. Victoria took notes with the same focused attention she brought to everything, asking sharp questions that demonstrated she'd actually thought about implementation, rather than just making grand gestures. By the time Marcus left, the sky had darkened into early winter evening, street lights reflecting off glass towers to create an artificial constellation. He walked to the subway with the folder under his arm, carrying promises that felt simultaneously too good to be true and exactly what his center needed. His phone buzzed 3 blocks from Hayes Technologies. A text from Victoria appeared on the screen. "Thank you for being honest with me today. Not many people are. And for what it's worth, I'd like to see Maya again sometime, if that's appropriate." V. Marcus stopped walking, causing a businessman behind him to swerve with an annoyed grunt. He stepped out of the foot traffic, read the message again, felt something complicated unfold in his chest. Victoria was reaching beyond professional boundaries, asking for access to the part of his life that mattered most. The request felt vulnerable in a way her corporate partnership offer hadn't, stripped of business justification and reduced to simple want. He thought about what Julia would say. She'd probably tell him everyone deserved second chances, that people could change, that isolating himself behind grief only hurt Maya in the long run. She'd probably tell him to let someone new in, to risk connection, even when risk meant potential loss. But Julia wasn't here to give advice, and Marcus was tired of making decisions based on what a ghost would want rather than what he actually felt. What he felt was complicated. Interest mixed with caution, hope mixed with skepticism, attraction mixed with the awareness that Victoria inhabited a world so different from his that the distance between them might be impossible to cross. He typed a response carefully. Maya would like that. She's been asking about you. Let me know when you're free and we can figure something out. M. The response came back almost immediately. Saturday? I could meet you at Prospect Park around noon if that works. V. Marcus agreed before he could overthink it, then pocketed his phone and descended into the subway, carried along by the current of commuters heading home to lives that ranged from joyful to tolerable to desperate. He wondered which category Victoria's life fell into, whether all that success and money and power translated into happiness or just more sophisticated forms of misery. Saturday arrived cold and bright, the kind of winter day that made the city look cleaner than it was. Sunlight turning dirty snow into something that almost sparkled. Marcus and Maya took the train to Brooklyn, Maya chattering about the drawing she'd made for Victoria. A picture of the three of them at the park with a caption that read, "Friends Forever," in careful block letters decorated with hearts and stars. They found Victoria near the entrance, standing slightly apart from the clusters of families and couples flowing in and out of the park. She wore jeans and a coat that looked expensive, but less aggressively so than her New Year's outfit. Her hair down instead of pulled back, sunglasses hiding her eyes even though the light wasn't bright enough to warrant them. Maya spotted her first, breaking into a run before Marcus could suggest they approach with more dignity. Victoria crouched down to catch Maya's hug, her arms coming around the small body with the same careful uncertainty Marcus had noticed at dinner, as if she were handling something precious but fragile and wasn't entirely sure of the correct technique. "I made you a picture." Maya thrust the drawing at Victoria, who took it with both hands and studied it seriously, giving the artwork the kind of attention that suggested she understood how much it mattered. "This is beautiful, Maya. Can I keep it?" "Yes. That's why I made it for you. So you can remember we're friends." Victoria's voice was quiet when she responded, something raw in her tone that made Marcus's chest tighten. "I won't forget. I promise." They walked into the park together, Maya between them, her small hand alternating between holding Marcus's and Victoria's as her attention shifted between them. They discussed inconsequential things, the weather, the best kind of hot chocolate, whether pigeons counted as real birds or if their ubiquity disqualified them from proper bird status. Maya argued passionately that pigeons were absolutely real birds and deserved respect, which prompted Victoria to admit she'd never really thought about it before, but Maya made an excellent case. Marcus watched Victoria interact with his daughter and saw someone trying very hard to get something right without entirely understanding what right looked like. She asked questions and listened to the answers, laughed at Maya's observations even when they weren't particularly funny, maintained the kind of focused attention that suggested this mattered to her in ways that transcended professional obligation. They bought hot chocolate from a vendor near the lake. Maya spilled a drop on her coat, but Victoria just wiped it away. "Coats are meant to be lived in." "That's what Mommy used to say." Victoria glanced at Marcus, who nodded permission. Maya could talk about Julia. "Your mom sounds smart about what matters." She was. "You would have been friends. You're both good at noticing things." The observation was simple but perceptive in the way Maya's insights often were, cutting through complexity to identify essential truths. Victoria did notice things, not necessarily the same things Julia had noticed, but she paid attention in ways that suggested she was learning how, that the skill wasn't instinctive for her, but she was committed to developing it anyway. They spent 2 hours in the park, walking paths that looped around frozen ponds, watching dogs chase tennis balls, finding a playground where Maya could swing while Marcus and Victoria stood nearby and talked about nothing consequential. It felt normal in a way that surprised Marcus, this easiness between them despite the vast differences in their circumstances and histories. As they prepared to leave, Maya ahead of them on the path, Victoria touched Marcus's arm lightly. "Thank you for letting me come today." "Thank you for wanting to." Victoria hesitated, and Marcus recognized the expression, someone working up courage to say something that felt risky. "I'd like to do this again. Regularly, if that's okay. Not just park visits, but coffee sometimes, or dinner, or whatever works for your schedule. I know I'm probably overstepping, asking to be part of your life when we barely know each other, but—" She stopped, took a breath, started again. "I haven't had friends in a long time. I don't remember how to do it correctly. But I'd like to try. With you." The admission was vulnerable in a way that Marcus understood cost her something. Victoria was used to control, to knowing the right answers, to succeeding at whatever she attempted through sheer force of will and resources. Admitting she didn't know how to have friends was probably harder for her than closing billion-dollar deals. "I'd like that too. But I need you to understand. My life is complicated. I'm a single father with a demanding job that doesn't pay enough, living in a neighborhood you've probably never visited, trying to give my daughter stability while teaching teenagers that their zip code doesn't determine their future. If we're going to be friends, you need to see that reality, not some sanitized version I present to make you comfortable." Victoria met his eyes directly. "I don't want sanitized versions. I want real. I've had enough artificial in my life to last forever." Over the next month, Victoria became a regular presence in Marcus's life in ways that felt both natural and surreal. She showed up at the center one Tuesday afternoon, arriving without advance warning, and spent 3 hours helping students debug code and explaining the practical applications of algorithms with the kind of clarity that came from actually understanding the material rather than just teaching it. The students were initially intimidated by her obvious wealth and authority, but Victoria had a knack for asking questions that made them feel smart rather than stupid, for validating their approaches even when suggesting improvements. Rosa pulled Marcus aside after Victoria left. "She's good at this. Really good. Not just the teaching, but the connecting. She actually listens." Marcus had noticed the same thing. Victoria seemed genuinely interested in the students' lives beyond just their coding projects, asking about their schools and families and what they wanted to be when they grew up. She didn't talk down to them or perform caring. She actually cared, and it showed. The equipment arrived 2 weeks later, professionally installed by a team Victoria sent without fanfare. New computers replaced the aging machines, fast and powerful and capable of running professional software that Marcus's students had only dreamed of accessing. Network infrastructure was upgraded, making the internet connection reliable instead of perpetually frustrating. The transformation was dramatic, turning the center from barely functional to genuinely competitive with what students in wealthy districts had access to. Marcus called Victoria that evening to thank her, and she deflected the gratitude with the same discomfort she showed whenever anyone acknowledged her generosity. "It's just equipment. You're the one doing the actual work. It's more than equipment. It's the difference between promising students a future and actually giving them tools to build one." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Can I tell you something?" "Of course." I've donated money to dozens of organizations over the years, written checks for amounts that would change people's lives, funded programs and scholarships and initiatives, but I've never actually seen what it meant. Never watched the equipment get installed or met the students who'd use it, or understood what difference it made beyond numbers in a report. This feels different. Better. Like I'm finally doing something that matters. Marcus heard the longing in her voice, the hunger for meaning that money couldn't purchase no matter how much of it you had. He understood it because he'd felt something similar in reverse. The frustration of having purpose but lacking resources, of knowing exactly what needed to be done but being unable to do it without help. You could do this more often. Not just with my center, but with others. Actually show up, meet the people you're helping, understand what your money means in practice rather than theory. I'd like that. I'm just not sure how. My schedule is complicated, and most nonprofits want money more than they want my time. Then find ones that want both, or create space in your schedule regardless. If this matters to you, make it matter enough to prioritize. The conversation felt intimate, despite taking place over phone rather than in person, as if they were sharing truths that only emerged in darkness or distance. Marcus found himself wanting to know more about Victoria, not the public figure whose biography appeared in business magazines, but the person underneath who'd somehow ended up alone on New Year's Eve with nowhere to go. They started meeting for coffee every week, conversations ranging from the center's needs to debates about technology and inequality. The debates were never hostile but never soft. Both believed their positions deeply, weren't interested in polite agreement. Marcus found the intellectual engagement refreshing after years of careful conversations around grief and parenting. But beneath the surface of their developing friendship, something else was building, a tension that neither of them acknowledged but both felt. The way Victoria's eyes tracked Marcus when he talked about his students, the way his awareness of her sharpened when she leaned forward to make a point, the moments when casual touches lasted slightly longer than strictly necessary. They were dancing around attraction without naming it, both of them aware that naming it would change everything, and neither quite ready for that transformation. "Daddy, do you like Miss Victoria?" Maya asked over dinner one evening. Like her? Marcus set down his fork. "I care about her. She's a good friend. But what if you wanted more? Would that be okay?" The question exposed his fear that letting someone new in would betray Julia. But Maya was monitoring his grief, wanting him to heal. "Would it be okay with you?" Maya nodded seriously. "Mommy would want you happy. You smile more when Miss Victoria's around." The question exposed the fear Marcus hadn't fully acknowledged, that letting someone new in would somehow betray Julia, that moving forward meant leaving her behind, that Maya would feel replaced or forgotten if he ever loved anyone else. "Would it be okay with you if I dated someone?" Maya thought about it carefully, her face scrunched in concentration. "I think Mommy would want you to be happy, and you seem happier when Miss Victoria is around. You smile more, and you don't get that look you get sometimes when you think I'm not watching, the one where you seem really far away and sad." Marcus felt his throat tighten. His daughter was 7 years old, and she'd been monitoring his grief closely enough to notice when it eased. The realization was simultaneously heartbreaking and hopeful. She wanted him to heal, had been waiting for signs that he could. "I'll think about it, baby girl. But right now, Miss Victoria and I are just friends. That's enough for me." Maya nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer, and returned her attention to her dinner. But Marcus sat with the question she'd raised, turning it over in his mind long after she'd gone to bed. What if he wanted more than friendship? What if Victoria did too? What would that mean for the careful equilibrium they'd established, for the professional partnership between their organizations, for Maya's heart if things didn't work out? The risks felt enormous. but so did the cost of not taking them, of living his entire life in the safe territory of what had been, rather than risking what might be. 3 weeks later, Victoria crossed a line she didn't realize existed. Marcus mentioned during their coffee meeting that the center needed to replace an aging printer, and Victoria nodded sympathetically while making mental notes. 2 days later, a brand new industrial printer arrived at the center, delivered by a technician who spent an hour setting it up and training Rosa on its features. Marcus called Victoria immediately, his voice tight with something she couldn't quite identify. "Did you send a printer to my center?" "Yes. You said yours was broken. I happened to know someone who could get one at cost, so I took care of it." "Is there a problem?" The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that Victoria realized there was, in fact, a problem. She just didn't understand what it was. "Victoria, we need to talk. Can you come to the center tonight after you finish work?" The request felt ominous, but Victoria agreed. She arrived at 7, the building mostly empty except for Marcus and Rosa, who gave her a look that might have been sympathy or warning before leaving them alone. Marcus was standing by the new printer, his arms crossed, his expression carefully controlled in a way that reminded Victoria of how he'd looked on New Year's Eve. Polite but distant. Present, but not really there. "Tell me what's wrong." Marcus took a breath, and Victoria saw him choosing words carefully. "You have to stop doing this. Stop buying things for my center without asking first. Stop solving problems I haven't asked you to solve." Victoria felt confusion sharp enough to be painful. "I don't understand. You needed a printer. I got you a printer. How is that a problem?" "Because you didn't ask if I wanted your help. You didn't check whether I had already ordered one or had a plan to address it. You just decided what I needed and made it happen, like I'm a child who can't manage his own organization." The accusation stung more than it should have. "That's not what I was thinking at all. I was just trying to help." "I know. But help without permission is control. And control, even when it comes from a good place, takes away my agency to make decisions about my own work." Victoria wanted to argue, wanted to explain that she hadn't meant to control anything, that she was just being efficient and using her resources to solve problems. But something in Marcus's expression stopped her. A hurt that went deeper than a printer. A frustration that had been building while she'd been oblivious. "How long have you felt this way?" "Since the computers arrived. Since you started volunteering without asking if I wanted your help. Since you inserted yourself into my center like you owned it." Each sentence landed like a small blow, revealing a pattern Victoria hadn't seen because she'd been too focused on solving problems to notice she was creating new ones. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize." "That's the problem. You don't realize. You're so used to fixing things that you can't see when fixing becomes overstepping." Victoria sat down in one of the student chairs, suddenly exhausted. "Tell me how to do better." Marcus sat across from her, his expression softening slightly. "Ask before you act. Check whether I actually want your help before you provide it. Understand that your money doesn't give you the right to make decisions about my center just because you've donated equipment. And respect that I've been running this place successfully for years without you, which means I'm capable of handling problems even if my solutions are slower or less expensive than yours would be." The critique was fair, and Victoria knew it. She'd been operating on instinct, see problem, solve problem, move on, without considering that the people she was helping might experience her solutions as intrusions. "I'll do better, I promise." "Good, because I want us to stay friends, but I can't be friends with someone who treats me like a project to be managed rather than a person to be respected." Victoria nodded, accepting the boundary even as part of her wanted to defend her intentions. She stood to leave, then hesitated. "Marcus? Thank you for telling me instead of just cutting me off. A lot of people would have just stopped returning my calls." I thought about it. But Maya would have been devastated, and honestly, I think you're worth the effort of teaching you how to be a better friend. The words were blunt but not unkind, acknowledging both her flaws and her potential. Victoria left the center feeling chastened but also oddly hopeful. Marcus hadn't rejected her. He'd just set boundaries. The fact that he thought she was worth teaching meant he believed she could learn. She tried. Over the next weeks, Victoria caught herself multiple times before overstepping, started to buy supplies for the center, and then asked Marcus first, began drafting an email to a grant foundation on his behalf, and then deleted it and asked if he wanted her to make introductions instead. The process of asking instead of acting felt unnatural, like trying to write with her non-dominant hand, but she forced herself to do it because Marcus's friendship mattered more than her efficiency. Most of the time, Marcus said yes to her offers, but sometimes he said no, and those refusals were important even when they frustrated her. They meant he was exercising agency, making choices about his own organization, rather than letting her wealth and influence steamroll his preferences. Their friendship deepened through this process of learning boundaries and respecting them. Victoria told Marcus about her childhood, wealthy parents who measured love in achievements, a house where affection was rationed and approval had to be earned through excellence. She told him about the loneliness of success, about how building her company had required sacrificing everything else until there was nothing else left to sacrifice. Marcus shared more about Julia, about how they'd met in graduate school when they were both broke and idealistic, about how she'd balanced his intensity with her warmth, about how her death had felt like losing not just a person, but a compass that had helped him navigate the world. He told Victoria about the months after the funeral when he'd barely functioned, when Rosa and other friends had essentially raised Maya while he learned how to be human again. These conversations happened in the margins of their time together, walking Maya home from school, lingering over coffee that had gone cold, sitting in Marcus's kitchen after his daughter had gone to bed. They were building something substantial, a foundation of mutual understanding that went deeper than their initial attraction or the transactional nature of their first connection. Victoria started to believe that maybe she could have this friendship that felt real, connection that wasn't predicated on what she could provide, someone who saw her as Victoria rather than as Hayes Technologies' CEO. She started to believe that maybe Marcus was right, that people could change if they were willing to do the work of changing. She started to believe a lot of things that were about to be tested in ways she couldn't anticipate. Because while Victoria was learning how to be a better friend, she was also making decisions that would eventually blow up everything she'd carefully built. Small decisions at first, barely worth noticing. Looking up information about Brooklyn Arts Academy, one of the most prestigious arts programs in the city, researching their application process, their acceptance rates, their scholarship opportunities, telling herself she was just gathering information, just being prepared in case it ever became relevant, not acknowledging to herself that she was already planning something Marcus hadn't asked for and wouldn't approve of, not recognizing that the pattern she thought she'd broken was actually just waiting for the right moment to reassert itself, not understanding that good intentions without permission were still violations, regardless of how much you cared about the people you were violating. The disaster was building, one reasonable-seeming decision at a time, and Victoria was too focused on learning to ask about printers to notice she was about to make a much bigger mistake. The application for Brooklyn Arts Academy sat on Victoria's desk for 3 days before she opened it. She'd downloaded the PDF on a Tuesday evening, telling herself she was just exploring options, just gathering information that might be useful someday. The fact that she'd specifically searched for arts programs suitable for gifted 7-year-olds, that she'd cross-referenced tuition costs with scholarship availability, that she'd already mentally calculated how much of Maya's portfolio would need to be assembled. None of that registered as crossing a line because the line itself had become blurred in her mind. She was helping. That's what friends did. They saw opportunities and they opened doors and they used whatever resources they had to make good things happen for people they cared about. The fact that Marcus had explicitly told her to ask before acting seemed, in this particular case, like an unnecessary obstacle to something that was obviously in Maya's best interest. Victoria opened the application on Friday morning, her coffee cooling beside her laptop while she read through the requirements. Portfolio of 10 to 15 pieces demonstrating artistic range and technical skill. 2 letters of recommendation from art educators. Parent statement explaining why this program would benefit the student. Interview with the admissions committee. Annual tuition of $35,000, though the website prominently advertised that 90% of students received some form of financial aid. She could make this happen. The thought arrived fully formed, accompanied by a surge of purpose that felt like coming home after being lost. She could contact Maya's elementary school art teacher, request samples of her work, commission a professional photographer to document her portfolio. She could write the parent statement herself. She'd observed Maya's artistic talent firsthand, understood her potential, could articulate why this opportunity mattered in ways that would resonate with admissions committees. She could establish a scholarship fund through Hayes Technologies specifically designated for students like Maya, could structure it so the financial burden disappeared entirely. She could solve this problem the way she solved every problem, with money and connections, and the absolute certainty that she knew what needed to happen. The fact that Marcus would be furious never quite penetrated her planning. Or rather, it penetrated and was dismissed, categorized as an obstacle to be managed rather than a fundamental violation of trust. Victoria told herself she'd explain after Maya was accepted, that Marcus would understand once he saw the opportunity she'd created, that his anger would fade when he realized how much this would help his daughter's future. She told herself a lot of things that turned out to be lies she was performing, for an audience of one. Monday morning, Victoria called Maya's school. The art teacher, a woman named Ms. Peterson who sounded young and enthusiastic, was initially confused about why a stranger was requesting student work. "I'm a family friend. Maya's father is aware I'm helping with this." The lie slipped out smooth as glass, so automatic that Victoria barely registered it as dishonest. She'd convinced herself that Marcus would have approved if she'd asked, therefore asking was redundant, therefore claiming his approval was essentially accurate, even if technically false. Ms. Peterson requested written permission. Victoria drafted an email that managed to avoid explicitly claiming to be Maya's parent while implying enough authority that the teacher wouldn't question it. She forged Marcus's name on a consent form with handwriting she'd practiced from his signature on a thank you card he'd sent after the computer installation. Each step felt justified in isolation. Each decision seemed reasonable when she was making it. She was just streamlining a process that would have happened anyway, just removing unnecessary friction from an outcome that was obviously correct. She didn't recognize herself becoming the person Marcus had accused her of being 8 years ago. Someone who steamrolled other people's agency because she believed her judgment was superior to theirs. She didn't see that every rationalization was another brick in a wall that would eventually collapse and bury everything she'd built with Marcus and Maya. She was too busy solving the problem to notice she was creating a catastrophe. The portfolio arrived 2 weeks later, 10 pieces of Maya's artwork professionally photographed and mounted. Victoria spread them across her conference room table, studying each one with the kind of attention she normally reserved for quarterly reports and acquisition proposals. Maya had talent, real, undeniable talent that went beyond typical 7-year-old enthusiasm. Her sense of color was sophisticated, her compositions balanced. Her subject matter demonstrated emotional depth that suggested she was processing her mother's death through art in ways that were both healthy and heartbreaking. These pieces would get her into Brooklyn Arts Academy. Victoria was certain of it. She just needed to complete the application, write the parent statement, secure the letters of recommendation. She worked through the checklist with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades turning ambition into reality through sheer force of will. The parent statement took 3 drafts before Victoria was satisfied. She wrote from Marcus's perspective, channeling what she imagined he would say if he'd agreed to apply. She described Maya's resilience after losing her mother, her natural affinity for visual expression, her need for an environment that would challenge and nurture her gifts. She wrote about economic barriers and systemic inequities and how Maya deserved opportunities that shouldn't be determined by her zip code. Everything in the statement was true. That's what Victoria told herself. Every word reflected genuine observations about Maya's talent and potential. The fact that Marcus hadn't written them, hadn't approved them, hadn't even known they were being written. That was a technicality that would be resolved once Maya was accepted. She submitted the application on a Wednesday evening, sitting alone in her office after everyone else had gone home. The submit button felt momentous, like she was launching something important into the world. She imagined telling Marcus and Maya the good news, imagined their gratitude, imagined Maya thriving in an environment designed for artistic excellence. She imagined everything except the truth, that she'd just committed fraud, violated trust, and demonstrated that she'd learned absolutely nothing from Marcus's attempts to teach her about boundaries and respect. The acceptance letter arrived 6 weeks later, faster than Victoria had expected. She opened it standing in her kitchen, having intercepted the mail delivery to the address she'd used, a P.O. box she'd rented specifically for this purpose, another small deception that had seemed justified at the time. The letter was enthusiastic, congratulating Maya on her acceptance and informing the family that she'd been awarded a full scholarship funded by the Hayes Technologies Foundation for Emerging Artists. Victoria had created the foundation 3 weeks earlier, seeding it with $500,000 and structuring it specifically to support students like Maya. The scholarship was legitimate, properly established through her company's charitable arm. The fact that she'd designed it specifically to benefit one 7-year-old girl without that girl's father's knowledge seemed, in Victoria's mind, like smart planning rather than manipulation. She held the acceptance letter, feeling triumph surge through her chest. She'd done it. She'd opened a door that would transform Maya's future, had given her access to resources and instruction that would develop her talent into something extraordinary. Marcus would be angry initially, but he'd come around. He had to come around, because refusing this opportunity would be choosing pride over his daughter's welfare. And Marcus wasn't that kind of father. Victoria called the school the next day, spoke with the admissions director, confirmed the scholarship details. Everything was arranged. All that remained was telling Marcus and Maya that their lives were about to change in ways they hadn't asked for but would eventually appreciate. She should have told him immediately, should have called that evening, confessed what she'd done, accepted his anger and dealt with the consequences. But Victoria kept finding reasons to delay. She wanted to prepare the right explanation, wanted to gather materials that would demonstrate how beneficial this would be, wanted to time the conversation for when Marcus would be most receptive. She wanted, in other words, to control the outcome even as she was claiming to provide opportunity. 2 weeks passed, then 3. The acceptance letter sat in Victoria's desk drawer, a ticking bomb disguised as good news. She saw Marcus and Maya regularly during this time, continuing their coffee meetings and park visits, maintaining the friendship while concealing the secret that would eventually detonate it. Every time Maya showed her a new drawing, Victoria felt a spike of guilt that she pushed down with reminders of how much Brooklyn Arts Academy would nurture that talent. Every time Marcus talked about his parenting philosophy or the importance of respecting children's agency, Victoria felt her stomach tighten with the awareness that she'd violated exactly those principles. But she didn't tell him, didn't confess, kept believing that the ends would justify the means once he saw the results. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. Marcus's name appeared on Victoria's phone screen while she was in a meeting with her executive team discussing market expansion strategies. She excused herself, stepping into the hallway, her heart rate already accelerating because something in the timing felt wrong. "Victoria, did you apply my daughter to Brooklyn Arts Academy?" His voice was controlled in a way that suggested enormous effort going into maintaining that control. Victoria's mind went blank for a crucial second, all her prepared explanations evaporating in the face of his question. "I can explain. Did you apply my daughter to a $35,000 a year arts program without my knowledge or permission? The repetition of the question, its specificity, told Victoria that Marcus already knew the answer. The school must have called him. Someone must have mentioned the acceptance or the scholarship or referenced the application in a way that revealed what she'd done. Yes, but Marcus, she got in. Full scholarship. This is an incredible opportunity. How dare you? The words were quiet, almost whispered, but they hit Victoria like physical force. She'd never heard Marcus this angry, had never heard his voice shake with the effort of not shouting. I'm sorry. I should have told you first, but I knew you couldn't afford to apply, and Maya has so much talent. You forged my signature. Victoria's breath caught. She'd forgotten about the consent form, the email to Ms. Peterson, the parent statement written in Marcus's voice. Each deception had seemed minor at the time, just paperwork, just logistics. Now they assembled into something that sounded, when stated plainly, like crimes. I didn't think. You never think. That's the problem. You see something you want to fix and you just do it. Consequences be damned. Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you understand what it means that you forged legal documents to make decisions about my child? Victoria leaned against the hallway wall, her legs suddenly unreliable. I was trying to help. Maya deserves opportunities. Maya deserves a father who makes decisions about her education. She deserves adults in her life who respect boundaries. She deserves to not be someone's project. She's not a project. I care about her. I care about both of you. Marcus laughed, and the sound was worse than his anger, bitter and disbelieving and exhausted. If you cared about us, you would have asked. You would have respected that I'm her father and I get to decide what's best for her. You would have trusted me to handle my own daughter's future instead of deciding you knew better. Victoria wanted to argue, wanted to explain that she did know better in this specific case because she understood what Brooklyn Arts Academy could provide in ways that Marcus might not fully grasp. But even as the thought formed, she recognized it for what it was, the same arrogance that had gotten her into this situation. What do you want me to do? I want you to withdraw the application. Immediately. And I want you to stay away from Maya. The second part landed like a punch to the chest. Marcus, please. I'm serious. Don't call, don't text, don't show up at the park or the center. My daughter has been asking about you every day, wondering when she'll see you next, and I'm not going to let her get more attached to someone who treats people like chess pieces to be moved around for their own satisfaction. I don't treat people like chess pieces. I made a mistake. I know I did. But I was genuinely trying to help. Help requires permission. What you did was control. And I won't have someone who can't tell the difference in my daughter's life. Victoria's office door opened down the hall, her assistant looking concerned. She waved him away, turning to face the window so no one could see her face. How long do I have to stay away? The question came out small, childlike. The voice of someone who'd just realized they'd destroyed something irreplaceable. I don't know. Maybe forever. Maybe just until I can trust that you've actually changed instead of just learning to hide the same behavior behind better language. Marcus. But the line was dead. He'd hung up, and Victoria was left standing in her company's hallway, surrounded by the trappings of her success, having just lost one of the only genuine friendships she'd managed to build in 20 years. She returned to her meeting on autopilot, sat through another hour of strategic planning without processing a single word. The moment the meeting ended, before she could retreat to her office and sink into regret, Victoria pulled out her phone and dialed Brooklyn Arts Academy. Her hands shook as she waded through 2 rings, 3, 4. Brooklyn Arts Academy Admissions Office. This is Victoria Hayes. I need to speak with Director Morrison immediately. Ms. Hayes, we're so excited about Maya Bennett's acceptance. If you're calling about the orientation schedule, I'm calling to withdraw the application. The line went silent. I'm sorry, what? Victoria's throat felt tight, each word scraping against her conscience like broken glass. The application was submitted without the father's knowledge or consent. Maya Bennett's acceptance needs to be withdrawn immediately. The scholarship fund I created needs to be restructured to remove any connection to specific students. I'll send written confirmation within the hour. Ms. Hayes, I don't understand. The application had parent consent forms, a signature. I forged the signature. The admission came out flat, factual. I forged legal documents to submit an application without parental permission. The application is invalid. If the school needs to involve legal counsel, I understand. But Maya and her father are not responsible for my actions. Another long pause. I'll need to speak with our director and legal team. This is highly irregular. I know. I'll have my lawyer send formal documentation taking full responsibility. But please remove Maya's file from your system immediately. She was never supposed to be there. Victoria hung up before her voice could crack. She opened her laptop with fingers that felt numb, pulled up the letter template she used for legal communications, and began typing. To whom it may concern. I, Victoria Hayes, CEO of Hayes Technologies, take full responsibility for fraudulent submission of documents to Brooklyn Arts Academy. She detailed every deception. The forged signature. The misrepresented parental consent. The scholarship fund designed to benefit a specific child without that child's father's knowledge. She didn't soften anything, didn't hide behind corporate language or legal technicalities. Just the facts, stated plainly, accepting whatever consequences followed. She signed it, scanned it, sent it to both the school and her own legal team with a single instruction. Any legal liability falls on me personally, not the company. Protect Hayes Technologies' reputation, but do not protect mine. Only then did she close her office door, sit at her desk, and stare at the acceptance letter that had briefly represented what she'd thought was generosity, but now understood was theft. Theft of agency, theft of choice, theft of Marcus's right to parent his own daughter. She'd taken something that didn't belong to her, and no amount of good intentions could change that fundamental violation. She'd taken a child who'd already lost her mother and inserted herself into that child's life, building trust and affection, only to reveal herself as untrustworthy in the most fundamental way possible. She'd taken a man who'd been learning to open his heart after years of grief and shown him that opening himself to her had been a mistake. She'd taken a friendship that had been teaching her how to be human and crushed it under the weight of her need to be useful. And for what? For the opportunity to put a 7-year-old in an arts program she hadn't asked for, to solve a problem that hadn't existed until Victoria decided it did, to prove to herself that she could make things happen regardless of what other people wanted. Victoria opened her laptop, pulled up her therapist's contact information. Chen had been seeing her for 3 months now, weekly sessions where Victoria had been making progress on understanding her need to control outcomes and her tendency to conflate usefulness with worthiness. She'd thought she was learning. She'd believed the changes were real. She sent Dr. Chen an emergency session request, then sat in her office as the afternoon light faded into evening, watching the city transform from day to night through her enormous windows. She thought about Marcus and Maya eating dinner without her, thought about how Maya would ask where Miss Victoria was and what Marcus would tell her. She thought about the hurt in his voice, the betrayal, the exhaustion of dealing with someone who kept making the same mistakes while claiming to be different. She thought about her parents, about how they'd raised her to believe that achievement was everything and connection was weakness. She thought about how she'd built an empire but couldn't maintain a single friendship without destroying it. She thought about sitting alone on New Year's Eve, about Marcus inviting her to his table when he had no reason to, about how she'd repaid his kindness by violating his trust in the worst possible way. The realization that followed was simple but devastating. She didn't know how to love people without trying to control them, didn't know how to care without making it transactional, didn't know how to be present without also being useful, because presence without utility felt like existing without purpose, and if she couldn't learn that distinction, she'd spend the rest of her life alone, no matter how many billions of dollars she accumulated or how many magazine covers featured her face. Her phone buzzed. A text from Rosa, Marcus's colleague from the center, whose number Victoria had saved after several volunteer sessions. "I heard what happened. Marcus told me. I'm not going to lecture you because I think you already know what you did wrong. I'm just going to say this. If you actually care about them, give them space. Real space. Not the kind where you're calculating how to win them back, but the kind where you respect that they get to decide if they want you in their lives. And maybe use that space to figure out why you keep doing this to people you claim to care about." Victoria read the message 3 times. Rosa had gotten to the heart of it. She was already strategizing, already thinking about how to fix this, how to demonstrate she'd learned her lesson and deserved another chance. Even her regret was transactional, focused on outcome rather than genuine transformation. She typed back a single word: understood. Then she did something that felt physically painful. She deleted Marcus's contact information from her phone, deleted the photos she'd taken of Maya's drawings, the videos of their park visits, the text thread that documented 3 months of friendship. She removed every easy path to reaching out, every temptation to check in or explain or try to make him understand. If Marcus wanted to contact her, he had her information. The decision to reconnect, if it ever happened, would be his to make. Victoria spent that night and the next several days in a fog of regret so thick she could barely function. She moved through her work responsibilities mechanically, made decisions that her team implemented without questioning, attended meetings where she contributed nothing beyond approval or denial of proposals others had developed. Her assistant asked twice if she was feeling well, and she lied both times, claiming a mild cold rather than admitting she was experiencing the emotional equivalent of a building collapse. Dr. Chen's emergency session cut straight to the wound. "Why do you think you have the right to make decisions for other people?" Victoria started with her prepared explanations, resources, opportunities, strategic deployment. Dr. Chen stopped her. "I didn't ask what you tell yourself. I asked what you actually believe." The truth came out harder than Victoria expected. "Because I do know better, I can see paths that someone living paycheck to paycheck can't see. I understand how elite institutions work." Dr. Chen nodded slowly. "You believe your wealth gives you superior judgment about other people's lives." Victoria wanted to deny it. Couldn't. "I don't know how to not believe that." "Then that's the work. Understanding that there are kinds of wisdom that have nothing to do with making money. Recognizing that a single father might understand his own daughter better than a billionaire who met her 3 months ago." Victoria left the session feeling flayed open, every defense mechanism stripped away to reveal the ugly assumptions underneath. She spent the weekend alone in her penthouse, forcing herself to sit with discomfort instead of solving it, to feel the full weight of what she'd done instead of rushing toward redemption. She thought about Marcus's life, the grief he carried, the students he taught, the daughter he was raising with such obvious care. She thought about how he'd invited her to his table on New Year's Eve, how he'd given her access to the most precious parts of his life, how he'd been teaching her through example what it meant to be present rather than useful. She thought about how she'd repaid all of that by deciding she knew what was best for his child. The shame was so intense it made her physically ill. She spent Sunday night alternating between the bathroom and her bed, her body rejecting the reality her mind was being forced to accept. Monday morning, Victoria did something she'd never done in 20 years of running her company. She called in sick. She spent the day in her apartment, not working, not strategizing, just existing in the empty spaces she'd been filling with productivity since she was old enough to understand that achievement equaled worth. She looked around her penthouse with new eyes, seeing it for what it actually was, a museum to her own success, sterile and beautiful and completely devoid of life. There were no plants because she'd never remembered to water them, no pets because her schedule couldn't accommodate their needs, No photographs of friends or family because she didn't have friends, and her family appeared in her life only as obligatory phone calls on holidays. She'd built everything she'd aimed for, and discovered it was nothing she actually wanted. The realization should have been devastating, but instead it felt like permission. Permission to admit that the path she'd been on for 2 decades was leading somewhere she didn't want to go. Permission to acknowledge that achievement without connection was just expensive loneliness wearing a designer suit. Permission to start over, to learn different skills, to become someone who could be loved for reasons that had nothing to do with what she could provide. Victoria opened her laptop and started researching volunteer opportunities. Not corporate partnerships where Hayes Technologies would get publicity. Not board positions where her business acumen would be valued. Just basic, unglamorous volunteer work. Literacy tutoring, food bank shifts, community center programs. Places where she could show up and be useful without being in charge, where her money and status were irrelevant to the work that needed doing. She signed up for a Tuesday evening shift at a Queens literacy center, listing herself as just Victoria. No last name, no corporate affiliation. The coordinator accepted her application without recognition or fanfare, adding her to a rotation of volunteers who helped elementary school students with reading comprehension. It felt small and insufficient compared to what she'd destroyed. But it was a start. 3 weeks passed with no word from Marcus. Victoria honored the boundary he'd set, didn't reach out, didn't manufacture excuses to be in places where she might accidentally encounter him. She went to therapy twice a week instead of once, worked through decades of conditioning that had taught her worth was earned through achievement rather than inherent in existence. She showed up to her literacy tutoring shifts and discovered she was terrible at it. The kids asked questions she couldn't answer, wanted emotional support she didn't know how to provide, needed patience she hadn't developed. She wanted to quit after the first session, but Rosa's text echoed in her mind. Real change meant continuing even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. So she kept showing up, week after week, sitting at a plastic table in a community center that smelled like old books and floor cleaner, helping 7- and 8-year-olds sound out words they didn't recognize. She learned their names, learned to celebrate small victories, learned that being bad at something didn't mean she should stop trying. She learned slowly and painfully what Marcus had been trying to teach her all along, that showing up was sometimes more valuable than solving. Her executive team noticed the change. She was less aggressive in meetings, more willing to delegate, quicker to admit when she didn't know something. Her assistant asked if she was sure she was feeling well, and Victoria realized that her team had gotten so used to her relentless intensity that normal human behavior registered as concerning. She was becoming a different person. Or maybe she was becoming the person she'd been before she decided that person wasn't good enough, before she started believing that worth had to be earned rather than simply existed. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. A month after Marcus had told her to stay away, Victoria received a letter. Not an email, but an actual letter, delivered to her office in an envelope with Marcus's handwriting. Her hands shook when she opened it, standing by her window, afraid of what it might contain. Victoria, I've had time to think about what happened, to process my anger and try to understand why you did what you did. Rosa helped. She has a way of cutting through bullshit that I appreciate even when it's uncomfortable. She pointed out that you weren't acting from malice, that you genuinely believed you were helping, that your biggest crime was caring too much in the wrong way rather than not caring at all. I don't know if I'm ready to see you yet. Maya asks about you constantly, and I've been honest with her about what happened. I told her you made a big mistake, that you tried to make decisions about her life that weren't yours to make, and that grown-ups sometimes hurt each other even when they're trying to help. She drew you a picture anyway. I'm enclosing it. She said to tell you she forgives you and hopes you'll come back when Daddy says it's okay. I'm working on getting to okay. I think I'll get there eventually, but I need you to understand something first. If we rebuild this friendship, It has to be on the foundation of you actually respecting my boundaries instead of just learning to hide when you're violating them. It has to be based on you accepting that my life is mine to manage, my daughter is mine to parent, and your role is to be present, not to be useful. Can you do that? Not just say you can, but actually do it, because if the answer is no, then we should end this now before Maya gets more hurt. Marcus. Victoria read the letter 3 times, then pulled out the drawing Maya had enclosed. It showed 3 stick figures, Marcus, Maya, and Victoria, standing under a rainbow. The figures were holding hands, and Maya had written, "Friends are still friends even when they mess up," in careful block letters along the bottom. She sat at her desk and cried, something she rarely allowed herself to do at work. Cried for the friendship she'd damaged, for the little girl who forgave her more easily than she forgave herself, for the man who was trying to find his way toward forgiveness despite having every reason to walk away. She pulled out a piece of paper, actual paper, because this response deserved the same medium Marcus had used, and wrote back, "Marcus, thank you for your letter. Thank you for not writing me off completely, for being willing to consider giving me another chance. I can't promise I'll never make mistakes. I'm learning skills I should have learned decades ago, and learning means failing sometimes. But I can promise that I'm genuinely trying to change. Not just behavior, but the beliefs underneath the behavior. I'm in therapy twice a week. I've started volunteering at a literacy center where nobody knows who I am and my money doesn't matter. I'm learning what it feels like to be bad at things, to struggle, to show up without having solutions. It's uncomfortable and humbling, and probably what I should have been doing all along. I don't know if I can be the friend you and Maya deserve, but I want to try. And I understand that trying means respecting your timeline, not pushing for reconciliation before you're ready, accepting that you might decide I'm not worth the risk. Whatever you decide, please tell Maya I forgive her too, even though she didn't do anything wrong. Tell her that grown-ups sometimes need time to figure things out, but that doesn't mean the friendship is over. Tell her I keep her drawings on my refrigerator, and I look at them every morning before I go to work. Victoria. She mailed the letter from the post office instead of having her assistant handle it, a small act that felt symbolically important. Then she went to her literacy tutoring shift and helped a second grader named Jaden work through a book about a dog who saved his family from a fire. Jaden struggled with every other word, and Victoria struggled with her impatience, but they made it through the book together. Small victories, that's what she was learning to value. Not billion-dollar acquisitions or magazine covers, but the tiny increments of progress that happened when you showed up consistently and didn't expect immediate transformation. 2 weeks later, her phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and Victoria's heart rate spiked before she even answered. "Victoria, I got your letter." "Thank you for reading it. I wanted to talk before we see each other, to establish some ground rules." Victoria sat down, pulled out a notebook, prepared to write down whatever he needed her to understand. "I'm listening. First, if we rebuild this, it's slow. Coffee, maybe once every 2 weeks. Not daily contact, not immediately returning to the intensity we had before. We need to test whether the changes you're making are real or just performance." Understood. Second, Maya comes back into the picture even slower. I'm not introducing you back into her life until I'm confident you won't hurt her again. That might take months. Can you accept that? The question hurt, but Victoria understood why he was asking it. Yes, I accept that. Third, the center. You can keep volunteering if Rosa says it's okay, but you don't get to make decisions about programming or equipment or anything else. You show up, you help with whatever task you're given, you leave. No initiatives, no improvements, no solving problems we haven't asked you to solve. Agreed. Fourth, and this is the most important one. If I tell you that you're overstepping, you stop immediately. You don't argue, you don't justify, you don't try to explain why your way is better. You just stop. Because the moment you start debating my boundaries is the moment this ends. Are we clear? Victoria took a breath, recognizing how much trust Marcus was extending by being willing to try it all. We're clear. And Marcus, thank you for not giving up on me completely, for believing I can be better. I'm not sure I believe it yet. But Julia used to say that people deserve the opportunity to prove themselves wrong about who they think they are. I'm giving you that opportunity. Please don't waste it. They set a coffee date for the following Tuesday. Neutral location, 1 hour maximum. When Victoria hung up, she felt something she hadn't experienced in the 6 weeks since Marcus had told her to stay away. Hope that wasn't dependent on her ability to fix things, but on her willingness to let things unfold without her control. She went to therapy and told Dr. Chen about the conversation. The therapist smiled, the first time Victoria had seen her look genuinely pleased rather than clinically neutral. This is progress. Real progress. You accepted his terms without negotiating. You acknowledged that he gets to set the pace. You're learning. It doesn't feel like enough. It's not supposed to feel like enough. Actual change feels inadequate because you're used to grand gestures and dramatic transformations. This is the work. Small steps, repeated consistently, without expecting applause or immediate results. Victoria left the session and went home to her empty penthouse, where Maya's drawings hung on her refrigerator alongside a schedule of her volunteer shifts and a list of boundaries she'd written out to remind herself of what she was learning. She made dinner for herself, actual cooking, not ordering in, and ate it while reading a book about emotional intelligence that her therapist had recommended. Small steps, consistent effort, no expectations of immediate transformation. It felt insufficient compared to what she'd destroyed. But it was all she had to offer, and for the first time in her life, she was beginning to understand that sometimes your best was enough, even when it fell short of perfect. Tuesday arrived. Victoria met Marcus at the coffee shop they'd frequented before everything fell apart, arriving 5 minutes early and ordering her usual before sitting at a table by the window. She watched people pass on the sidewalk, reminded herself to breathe, resisted the urge to prepare talking points or strategic objectives. This wasn't a negotiation. It was two people trying to determine if friendship was still possible after trust had been shattered. Marcus arrived exactly on time, and Victoria noticed immediately that he looked tired. Not just physically tired, but emotionally exhausted, the kind of weariness that came from carrying too much for too long. She wanted to ask if he was okay, wanted to offer help, caught herself before the impulse became action. Asking if he was okay was fine. Offering unsolicited help was not. "How are you?" Marcus sat down with his coffee, regarding her carefully before answering. "Honestly? Exhausted. Maya has been struggling since you left. She doesn't understand why you disappeared, and I've been trying to explain adult complications to a 7-year-old who thinks friendship should be simple." Victoria felt the guilt like a physical weight. "I'm sorry, I never meant to hurt her." "I know, but impact matters more than intention. She's been drawing pictures of the three of us and asking when you're coming back. And I've been trying to figure out how to protect her, while also not teaching her that people who make mistakes should be permanently exiled." The words were fair, delivered without malice, but with absolute honesty. Marcus wasn't trying to make her feel worse, but he wasn't protecting her from the consequences of her actions either. "What have you told her?" "That you made a mistake, and I was very angry about it. That grown-ups need time to work through hurt feelings. That forgiveness is important, but so is making sure the same mistake doesn't happen again." Victoria nodded, absorbing this, recognizing that Marcus was teaching his daughter complex lessons about trust and boundaries and second chances. "She sent me a drawing with the letter you wrote." "Ooh, I know. She wanted you to have it." "It's on my refrigerator, along with the others she's given me. I look at them every morning." Something in Marcus's expression softened slightly. "She'd like that. Knowing her art matters to you." They talked for the full hour. Marcus shared center updates, students in college, the computers transforming learning. Victoria shared volunteer struggles, bad at tutoring, learning humility. "This was good," Marcus said when the hour ended. "Can we try again in 2 weeks?" Victoria wanted to negotiate for sooner, caught herself. 2 weeks. I'll be here. If that goes well, we'll talk about you seeing Maya. She'd shown up, respected boundaries, practiced presence without usefulness, small victories, adding up. Marcus left, and Victoria sat with her empty coffee cup, feeling something that might have been peace or might have been acceptance. She'd shown up. She'd respected his boundaries. She'd practiced being present without being useful. Small victories. They were adding up, one difficult conversation at a time. In therapy, Dr. Chen asked, "How did it feel? Not being in control?" "Terrifying and liberating. I just had to show up and be honest. That's the work. Keep doing that." At her volunteer shift that evening, Victoria helped kids with multiplication, restraining herself from suggesting better techniques. Small victories. They were adding up. She was becoming someone new, someone who could exist without constantly proving her value, someone who understood that presence was a gift even when it came without solutions. She was becoming, slowly and imperfectly, someone who might deserve the second chance Marcus was considering giving her. The work continued. Coffee every 2 weeks, conversations that gradually grew longer and more comfortable as Marcus tested whether her changes were performance or genuine transformation. Victoria proved herself through consistency rather than grand gestures, showing up when she said she would, respecting boundaries he established, accepting his pace without pushing for faster progress. 3 months after their first post-disaster coffee, Marcus finally said the words Victoria had been hoping for but trying not to expect. "I think you're ready to see Maya again, if you still want to." Victoria's breath caught, relief and terror mixing in equal measure. "I want to, very much, but I'm also scared I'll mess it up again." Marcus smiled slightly, the first real smile she'd seen from him since the phone call that ended everything. "That fear is probably a good sign. It means you understand what's at stake." They arranged a park visit for the following Saturday, just an hour, closely supervised. When Maya spotted Victoria from across the playground, she broke into a run before Marcus could suggest a more measured approach. Victoria crouched down and caught her, hugging her back with tears streaming down her face. "I missed you so much." Maya pulled back, studying Victoria's face with the seriousness that came naturally to children who'd experienced loss. "Daddy said you made a mistake. Are you going to make mistakes again?" Victoria could have lied, could have promised perfection. Instead, she chose honesty. "Yes, I'll probably make mistakes again, because I'm still learning how to be a good friend, but I promise I'm trying really hard, and when I mess up, I'll apologize and try to do better." Maya considered this carefully, then nodded. "Okay, that's fair. Everybody makes mistakes, even grown-ups." She took Victoria's hand and pulled her toward the swings, and Victoria followed, grateful for 7-year-old wisdom that understood forgiveness better than most adults ever learned. Marcus watched them from a bench, his expression unreadable. But when Victoria glanced over after pushing Maya on the swings for 10 minutes, he raised his hand in a small wave. Not quite trust, not yet, but acknowledgement that she was trying, that the trying mattered, that maybe, eventually, they'd find their way back to something that looked like friendship. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. Epilogue. 12 months after New Year's Eve, Victoria Hayes stood in the same boardroom where everything had begun, watching Marcus Bennett present the Bronx Youth Tech Initiative expansion to a board that had learned to listen when he spoke. The quarterly numbers still glowed on screens behind them. Revenue still climbing, market share still expanding. But the presentation that mattered had nothing to do with profit margins and everything to do with the partnership they'd built from the ruins of her mistakes. The model we're proposing, Marcus said, advancing his slide, isn't just equipment donation. It's equity stakes for center directors, employment pipelines for students, mentorship that doesn't treat communities like charity cases. We've proven it works in the Bronx. Now we scale it. Thomas Chen leaned forward, removing his reading glasses. Mr. Bennett, these numbers are remarkable. 87% retention, 71% college acceptance, 15 students employed at Hayes Technologies directly from the program. The board approves the expansion unanimously. Victoria watched Marcus gather his materials, saw the quiet satisfaction in his posture. He'd earned this moment through years of unglamorous work, showing up for students who needed someone to believe in them. She'd helped, yes, but she'd learned to help the right way. By asking, by respecting boundaries, by being present rather than useful. As the board members filtered out, Marcus found her by the windows. "You didn't say anything during the presentation," he said. "It wasn't my presentation to give. You built this. I just provided resources. That's growth." The corner of his mouth lifted. "A year ago, you would have needed to be in the spotlight. A year ago, I wouldn't have understood that the spotlight isn't the point." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the city below. A year of difficult conversations, boundary setting, learning to be present without controlling. A year of coffee every 2 weeks becoming weekly, then twice weekly. A year of supervised park visits with Maya becoming regular Saturday mornings. A year of rebuilding trust one kept promise at a time. "How's Maya?" Victoria asked. "Thriving. Still asks about you constantly, but now it's, 'When's Miss Victoria coming?' Not, 'Where did she go?'" Marcus pulled out his phone, showed her a photo. "She wants you to see her latest drawing before Saturday. Says it's her best one yet." Victoria felt the familiar tightness in her chest. Gratitude mixed with the awareness of how close she'd come to losing this. "Tell her I can't wait. She might just text you herself. She's been practicing on my phone." As if summoned, Marcus's phone buzzed. A message from Maya, carefully spelled in 7-year-old concentration. "Miss Victoria, I made you something special for Saturday. It's a surprise. Love, Maya." Victoria smiled, showing Marcus her own phone, where she'd already received a copy. Too late. She's getting efficient. Marcus pocketed his phone, turned to face Victoria fully. "Speaking of Saturday, I was thinking maybe we could do dinner after the park, the 3 of us. Nothing fancy, just dinner." The invitation landed differently than it would have a year ago. No performance, no grand gesture, just a simple offer of time together, the kind of ordinary thing friends did. "I'd like that. Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself. Actually show up instead of trying to fix everything, and we're good." "I can do that." Marcus moved toward the door, paused. "You know what Julia used to say? That redemption isn't about erasing what you did wrong. It's about who you become after you break something." Victoria's throat tightened. He rarely mentioned his late wife, and when he did, it meant something.
What would it be?
"I think she'd say you're becoming someone who deserves the second chance you got." Marcus met her eyes, and Victoria saw something there that hadn't been present even a month ago. Not quite romance, not yet, but possibility. Trust that was earned rather than given. "I think I'd agree with her." He left, and Victoria stood alone in the boardroom, surrounded by the trappings of success that used to feel like enough. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Maya. This one, a photo of a drawing in progress. 3 stick figures holding hands with careful block letters spelling family underneath. Not quite accurate yet, but maybe eventually, with patience and presence and the willingness to let things unfold without control. Maybe someday it could be. Victoria gathered her things, but instead of returning to her office, she headed for the elevator. She had a volunteer shift at the Queen's Literacy Center in an hour. A second grader named Jaden was working on reading comprehension, and he'd specifically requested her because, as he'd told the coordinator, Miss Victoria doesn't give up on me even when words are hard. The elevator descended, carrying her away from boardrooms and quarterly reports, toward an afternoon of helping a kid sound out words in a community center that smelled like old books and floor cleaner. Toward a life that was smaller than the one she'd imagined, but somehow larger than the one she'd built. Toward being present instead of useful, which turned out to be the most useful thing she could be. The doors opened onto the lobby, and Victoria Hayes, CEO, billionaire, woman who'd nearly lost everything that mattered, stepped out into the afternoon light and headed toward the subway. She had somewhere to be. Someone was waiting for her, and for the first time in 20 years, that was enough.